So on behalf of OxWIP, Oxford Women in Politics 2017 executive team, the women standing, can all the OxWIP members stand up, please? You here? Some people are walking in, but here they are. So on behalf of this year's team, I would like to welcome you into our inaugural event, the role of identity politics in global governance. Thank you for coming this evening. What's happening around us? 52% of eligible British voters voted in favor of leaving the EU following a referendum, popularly known as Brexit. The decision for many to leave was driven by a strong sense of nationalism, xenophobia towards immigrants. President Trump ran a campaign platform dubbed as being xenophobic, Islamophobic, and racist. One of the first decisions he made as president was to issue an executive order banning immigrants from 7 Muslim countries. We now know that there's a revised version floating around. Recent waves of xenophobic protests towards African immigrants have sparked across South Africa. The upcoming French election sees Front National leader Marine Le Pen gaining ground, plus their prominent anti-EU or nativist candidates running in almost all parts of the European elections. So, for OxWIP, the rise of identity politics in global governance transcends borders. It's becoming clear that who we are, what passports we hold, how we choose to worship God, and the color of our skin shapes the way policies are articulated in the global space. As a Women in Politics Society, established in 2004, as a means to address the significant gender imbalances in politics and leadership roles, and to serve as a resource for women leaders in public service, academia, and the private sector, we are uniquely positioned to host this prestigious panel before you. Historically, the rise of feminism and women's movements stem from the recognition that both identity structures and is structured by political institutions and formal governance more broadly. Following feminist tradition of moving identity from the margins to the center of public discourse, we hope this panel discussion will be an occasion to broaden our conceptualization of identity politics beyond siloed issues of immigration and gender gaps to a broader framework critical to understanding and changing our global society. So the agenda for today is quite simple. I will introduce our high-level panelists, professors and leading thought leaders in their fields. We're quite grateful to have them here. They will respond to the topic, the role of identity politics in global governance. We may have some time to do one follow-up question, and then we'll throw it out to all of you here in the room. We'll take about 2 to 3 questions at a time. We want this to be as interactive as possible, but we do encourage that you keep all your questions sharp, short, and sweet, so that we can go through as many questions as possible. And please remember to speak directly into the microphone. Ida, our co-vice president, will close the event and invite you for a drinks reception afterwards. So I'll start introducing our panel speakers. Professor Nairi Woods is a Rhodes Scholar and an Oxford alumni, and where you see us today, led the creation of the Blavatnik School of Government, my home, and is the inaugural dean as well as professor of global economic governance. Her research focuses on global economic governance, the challenges of globalization, global development, and the role of international institutions. She's the founder of the Global Economic Governance Program and co-founder of the Oxford-Princeton Global Leaders Fellowship Program. Professor Woods has served as an advisor to the IMF Board, UNDP's Human Development Report, and to the Commonwealth Heads of Government, and is currently a member of the Academic and Policy Board of Oxonia, a board member of the Moe Ibrahim Foundation, and a trustee of the European. Professor Tariq Ramadan, thank you for being here this evening. Professor Tariq Ramadan is a professor of contemporary Islamic studies here at Oxford. He teaches at 2 faculties, one the Oriental Studies and Theology and Religion. He's a senior fellow, research fellow at St. Anthony's College and Doshisha University, Kyoto, Japan. He's a visiting professor at the Faculty of Islamic Studies in Qatar, director of the Research Center of Islamic Legislation and Ethics, in Doha, Qatar, and president of the think tank European Muslim Network in Brussels, and a member of the International Union of Muslim Scholars. His research interests include the issues of Islamic legislation, politics, ethics, Sufism, and the Islamic contemporary challenges in both Muslim-majority countries and the West. He's active at both academic and grassroots level, and he has recently released a book that you should all get called Islam, the Essentials, and he has two forthcoming, it's a good book, and he has two forthcoming books next year. Islamic Ethics, a very short introduction, the Islamic Ethics, Critical Concepts in Islamic Studies. Professor Elike Bohemer, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Excuse me if I'm butchering it. Professor Elike, just like Professor Nairi Woods, is also a Rhodes Scholar and an Oxford alumni. And she's a professor of the world literature in English at the English faculty here at Oxford, and currently director of the Oxford Research Center in Humanities Torch. She is a resounding figure in the field of colonial and post-colonial studies, and internationally known for her research in Anglophone literature of empire and anti-empire. She's an acclaimed novelist and a short story writer, and her most recent book in 2015 was called The Shouting in the Dark. Professor Elike's creative work, like her critical and historical research, explores issues of migration, identity, friendship, diaspora, race and gender representation, nationalism, and the global, in particular relating to sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and contemporary contemporary Britain. Please help me in welcoming our panelists. Thank you. All right, so I get the stares. So we're going to start, as planned.
And paid for.
And paid for. With Professor Nairi Woods.
As not paid for. Thank you, Fatou. Unexpectedly called upon first, but there we go. I think what I want to say is I'd like to start by saying that I think it's perilous to describe voters across Europe and the United States who are, whether it's voting for Brexit or voting for President Trump, as nationalistic and xenophobic, because I don't think that voters are. And I think that if we describe them in that way, we start losing the opportunity to think about how our society functions and what role identity plays. So I think the first thing I want to say is that identity for all of us is fluid and contextual. So just think for a moment what we learn from behavioral scientists when they tell us that if you get a room full of women to do a maths test where they don't identify themselves on the test, and you take a same room full of women and at the top of the maths test ask the question, are you male or are you female? Tick the box. Women perform in that maths test measurably worse when they've had to identify themselves as female. Now just think about what that's telling us about identity. It's telling us that we all have lots of different identities. I can be female, a New Zealander, an academic, a dean, a mother, whatever. Which identity is in the foremost part of my mind depends on my context. In other words, the context I'm in switches on one of my identities. So in that maths test, when the first question women are asked is, are you male or female? You've switched on an identity in their brain, and you've switched on an identity that reminds them that they're female. And because we live in a society where females are constantly told that girls are not very good at maths, they underperform. They don't perform as well. Just by switching on that identity, you actually alter their performance. So I just want to start by saying identity is contextual. That the same person who one might think is xenophobic and nationalistic because of who they voted for is responding to a context. And that context is one deeply set by governments. So now let's move to government. So what do governments do? The head of a government you could describe as a communicator in chief, the head of a political campaign. What they are doing is shaping a context, and they're shaping it partly through what they say. And yes, we are seeing leaders who use nationalistic and xenophobic language. And therefore, they shape a context which might be telling you that you personally are greatly at risk. And the thing that most puts you at risk are people who are different to you. That those people, and they're different to you because they have a different religion or a different color of skin, or they come from a different part of the world, or they're from a different neighborhood. In other words, you're being triggered. The context that those politicians are setting for you is triggering one identity. Suddenly, instead of feeling British, you feel English. Suddenly, instead of feeling English, you feel white English or Bangladeshi English, right? Suddenly, your identity is being triggered. So government does that through words, and government does that through policies. So let's think about policies and how they also affect the way identity enters into politics. In Britain over the last decade, one of the things that the government has cut as part of a long series of government cuts in public services are local childcare centres. Now think for a moment what subsidised childcare centres do. They bring young, often single mothers from all different communities, from white working class communities, from Bangladeshi immigrant communities, from different parts of Britain. They bring those mothers together because they have to pick up and drop off their children because they're there playing with their children. What psychologists again have to tell us about identity and politics is the more mixing you have between one group and another, the less they will fear one another. The less they fear one another, the more they'll interact with one another. The more they interact, the less they fear. This is a virtuous cycle. But so too, you can have a vicious cycle where the less interaction you have, the more fear you have, and the less interaction you have. So if you think about the simple policy of closing those childcare centres, which was a government trying to save money, what they've done is created communities where there is no mixing. So when in one of those communities, the white working class mother reads that there are refugees or immigrants getting 6-bedroom council houses just down the road, she doesn't have the opportunity to meet with a young mother from that other community to hear that, of course, that's rubbish. There's no such thing as a 6-bedroom council house in Britain anymore. And so you can actually stop that fear-mongering quite quickly. So context is very important to identity, and government is very important to identity. And so what we're seeing in the current context, I think, are people who have 3 things that they're worried about. The first is in every OECD country since 2005, wages have been stagnant for most people, and they now face a possible job loss because of technology. Most people's jobs will be taken by robots. So this is not a rosy future. So the first thing is an economic precariousness. The second thing is a sense of social disdain, that we've seen communities, and we're seeing this in Britain, in France, in the United States, a sense that the elite are the left behind. The people who are voting for President Trump, they're voting for Brexit, they're voting for Marine Le Pen, are people who feel that they're being socially disdained by the establishment. And so they want to kick the establishment in the face. And they want to do that by voting. And it's a revenge for disdain. And the third thing that we can see across these countries is a sense of cultural precariousness. And that is very much shaped, again, by this context, this government and these government actions. A sense that people's own culture is at risk. That because they don't know this thing that they're afraid of, they worry that it will somehow overwhelm them. That culturally they'll no longer be able to hold on to what they believe is important to them. And so I think rather than starting by saying these are nationalists and xenophobes, I would start by saying that these are people who feel economically precarious, socially disdained, culturally worried, and they're living in a context which is bringing to the fore an identity which is very easy for politicians to play. The xenophobes are the politicians who choose to play on people's fear and precariousness. What we have to do as Democrats wanting to ensure that people are empowered and have a governance system that works is think very carefully about which parts of identity we're shaping. What is the context we're providing? What's the politics that we're providing? And what's the understanding we have of the people that are being played? Because if we just disdain them, if we just put them in a box and say they're beyond hope, then we're doing every bit as much damage to our societies, which are precarious, as those who are shaping a new politics of hatred. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Woods, for framing the conversation. That's why you went first. I promise that's why you went first. It's intentional. Professor Ramadan, how would you respond to what Professor Woods has sort of framed for us in answering the question?
Yeah. Thank you first for the invitation, and I think that I agree almost with everything that you said, starting with two things which are important. Is yes, identity is contextual, it's always depending on the environment and who, in fact, it's not only contextual about where, but who is asking the question and why this question is asked, which is also very important. The second has to do with, I would take a broader picture in this discussion by saying, I agree, we can't just say that the people who are voting for even, Marine Le Pen in France or UKIP here or Brexit are people who are per se nationalistic or xenophobes. I think we have to go deeper in the discussion and to try to understand what is happening. And in fact, in our societies, what we see today, when you listen, for example, to some of the thinkers telling you, it's the end of ideology, so we are not dealing with structured way of vision of politics in our world, that's a very important starting point. Why? Because we need to ask ourselves why politicians are playing with identities. What is missing in the political arena that is not now helping us citizens to come and to have a political discussion on policies and not to deal only with emotions? So that's a very important question about what is happening in politics, while the people who are asking now for politics and have political ideas are very often the people who are dominated and not the dominant. The dominant, they are very happy to deal with identities. When you are colonized, you ask the question why. When you are colonizing, forget about it, we have the power and we decide. So you can play with emotions when you have power. You are very often victims of emotional politics when you are in a situation where this is problematic. And in our world, the global world, when we speak about globalization, we speak about global communication, global culture, global economy, that's all fine. But what the reaction to this is people coming back to their identity and thinking the only way for me to protect myself from what is happening is to come back to my identity. And governments are going to play with this because this is the best way to help to give an answer without talking about politics and without talking about policies. That's the problem that we have within our society, I would say. And the two main characteristics of this are playing with fear, as you said, and you mentioned this, which is, and when you play with fear, you play with something which is very important, security. And you cannot blame the people asking for security. They want to have a security in their lives. So, of course, if you put them in a situation where the context is all about being scared of what is not you and what is around you, at the end, you don't talk about politics, but you talk about emotions, and you are, in fact, the victims, or you could be the victim of such a policy. This is one. And the second thing that I'm always, and when I was here the last time I came, we were talking about this, is what we have now, which is crossing the borders, not only in the West, because you were asking the question in the West, you can see this in African countries, you can see this in the Middle East, is populism. It's populism, it's the way the people are. So people, it's a positive word, populism, it's a negative way of dealing with people. And I would say that what we see today, and this is why I'm not blaming the people, I want to ask ourselves how we can get rid of this and can respond to what is happening today. What we see today, and why, for example, you see reaction to Geert Wilders, who might be winning the next election in the Netherlands, Marine Le Pen, and not only, even in this country here, you have trends of people who are changing the perception of living together. It's a kind of something which is universal, and that you can see it crossing the board. And when I'm talking about populism, I'm saying 4 characteristics that I keep on repeating because I think it's important. The mindset, which is when you don't have ideologies, when you don't deal with politics and policies, you end up dealing with emotional politics, and emotional politics is us versus them. It's the security thing, it's us defining ourselves versus all the others. And once again, it's not only in the West. You can see this in Africa. We were just talking about Srebrenica this morning in St. Anthony's College. And it all started like this. It's us versus them. In a society which was a pluralistic society, we ended up saying you versus me, and then we saw what happened. The second thing is very simple answers to very complex questions. You want to deal with unemployment, it's them. We want to deal with, it's these foreigners. We are in danger. Don't welcome the migrants, don't welcome the refugees, because among them there are terrorists, potential terrorists. So it's us versus them. Very difficult question about we go and we bomb Syria, but we don't want them to come. So once again, very simple. You want to solve employment, just get rid of all these foreigners. That's the answer, and it works. It works, but you cannot blame the people. It's just, once again, the context is pushing the people to think that, okay, that's the way forward. And in the global world, when you lost your all, references, that's working. I was working at the grassroots level in Rotterdam, dealing with people saying, this is no longer my society. This is no longer my country. So the perception is these people are changing us, taking our jobs. So the answer is this. Are we going to blame them or to blame the governments and the way they are playing with this? Because when there is a lack of policy, play with emotions. This is the second. The third one, it's something which is also important. It's, in fact, connected, is always dealing with this fear and emotions. That's also very important. Populists are dealing with fear. And there is a last one, which we see everywhere. And at the end, the most difficult thing to get when you deal with politics is to see this sense of the victim mentality. Populists are nurturing the victim mentality even in our society. We are the victims of potential new colonization of all these foreigners that are coming. So we got this from, all the rhetoric of Bush dealing with terrorism is that we are the victims. So we don't ask ourselves, what is our responsibility? We ask ourselves, why are we the victims of all these people? So we play on this. And this is something which is happening everywhere. Having said that, if you look at what is happening everywhere, the 2 reactions that we have with this are very common in our societies. The first is to focus on the legal. When you deal with emotion, just put more law, just prevent the people from entering, prevent them, and define yourself through the law. So, for example, you have people in my country, Switzerland, when it came, for example, to the Muslim presence, is 4 minarets, just change the constitution. We don't want minarets. Change the law of the country. What we had and what we have today, the new decision of Trump regarding the 6 countries, now it's 6, it's not 7 countries, is just, once again, more law, ban them and prevent them from entering. This is the way we are going to be secure. This is the way we are going to get our security. So more law. The problem is that the way it's presented is protecting them, protecting us from them. At the end, it's us being imprisoned in the whole thing. We are all the victims of this. More legal framework and more law are not helping us and not protecting our freedom, but it's done in the name of our own security. So you are scared, we are going to take care of your security. So more law, less freedom. The second thing which is also coming out of this, it's this identity politics, is to define ourselves against the other. And then this is the negative definition of identity. Because this is, once again, it's very important what you said about this scientific experience with people having to put and to get a sense, an awareness of their identity is something that we have everywhere. So we reduce the notion of identity to one single identity to the point that you're asking, what are you first? What the multiple identities that we have is the starting point of us dealing with our own complexity. But with emotional politics, this is not where you come with the complexity. You come with simplification, simplistic way of dealing with your identity. And a negative identity is to define myself against all the others. So this is, once again, something that we can find at the grassroots level, but also something that we can find where? So this is why I'm saying that when it comes to this understanding, look at the African countries, things that we never saw before. In Ivory Coast, even we know about Rwanda, it was just impossible to think about something could happen like that. Is that at the end, the Hutu against the Tutsi, when 10 years before you were talking to people from Rwanda and say, it was not possible to think about something like this happening in this country. In Ivory Coast, to the point that you have people coming from north and south and Christian, and this was not the case in Central African Republic. Exactly the same. What we have exactly the same identity politics, people against each other within countries where this was not the case. And go now and look at what is happening in India and look at what is happening in the Middle East. We have also religious populism. The Salafi trend is a religious populism, is the way we define ourselves in a literal way against all the other. So there are religious populists that are working by defining us versus them exactly the same. It has nothing to do with politics, it has nothing to do with a vision, it has nothing to do with ideology. It's all about fear, protection, security, us versus the other. And it works at the grassroots level. Having said that, we can just sit down and say, okay, the consequences of all this, I would say it's that the positive could become very negative. It's we deal with the people, we end up dealing with populism, and this is something which is dangerous. And there are things that are even deeper than that. You know, for almost 25 years, being a European, I was saying to my fellow European Muslims, you are citizens in this country, so be citizens and be involved in this. And I still think that this is the answer, the sense of belonging to the nation. To the nation, not the negative side of the nation being nationalistic. But there is one thing that now it's worrying me. Even with the people who were coming from the South and then ended up being European citizens or American citizens or Western citizens, is in our understanding of our identity as citizen and saying, I belong to the country, the fact that we are able today to make a difference between our citizens and the people who are coming from outside that are not exactly having the same status as us. So when citizenship comes first and you forget about humanity, there is a problem. So when your people, when they are killed, you are reacting. But when people coming as refugees and being or dying in the Mediterranean Sea because they are migrants and refugees, and it's as if this is normal, because our citizens has an other status as people, the difference between humanity and citizenship, our nation, is something which is really problematic. It's really problematic. I think that we are accepting something which, for me, in humanistic terms, it's unacceptable. It's that our reaction to our people. So it was always like this. But when we come with the global world, when we know what we are doing or not doing in the Middle East or in African countries, and they are coming, and now we are selecting who could come and who couldn't come, and differentiating between the status of the people, I think it's problematic. So I would say here that my take on this is our reaction as citizens, as students, as people trying to do something is this reconciliation with complexity and political vision, with politics, and not emotional politics, with ideas, with thoughts, with complexity. I think this is what is missing. And if there is something that the university should do is to equip the students with a sense of complexity, nuance, and trying to get a sense of what does it mean? Does it mean something to speak about domination and being dominated? Does it mean something about human beings and citizenship and the sense of belonging to a country? A policy, when it comes to employment, we have to reconcile ourselves with very simple, basic things that are lost in this discussion today about global governance, I would say. And I would, again, speak about something which, when it comes to governance, to reconnect ethics and governance. Ethics, values, and the priority that we have with some values that I think that in our discussion is not always there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ramadan. You know, Professor Nairi talked about identity being triggered in the context. By the way, we are learning at BSG the complexity of politics and how to unpack it as future government students and leaders. So they did a good job here. We're in the right place to unpack the difficulty of politics. No, but Professor Woods talked about identity is triggered in context, and what that means. And that ties into what you're talking about, this emotional complexity, us versus them. And I'll tell you why I'm saying this. Professor Bohemian, okay, I'm trying to, for me, when we talk about emotional complexity in the context of politics, and how context triggers identity. I wonder what for me, I don't know how you cannot become emotionally, how it's not emotionally complex in terms of politics. I'm a Muslim, Black African woman. So when I'm in the Middle East, my passport says Fatima, and yet there's a barrier in terms of you're Black, you're a woman, therefore you're a slave, and you're nothing in this context. When I come to the West, my passport says Fatu. I am not Fatima anymore. A different identity comes out as a form of protecting oneself and trying to really, as much as possible, close this us versus them complexity in my identity as I move around the world. So when we're talking about, and you come from a critical humanities interdisciplinary perspective, how would you respond to both Professor Woods and Professor Ramadan's take on the role of identity politics in global governance?
Thank you, Fatu. Well, how I would respond, I think, is by resonating with a number of the things that they've said. I have something of a prepared statement here because I thought I should, coming from my humanities space, I should be well equipped and well prepared to address these global governance people. So, so I'll launch in, right? But I think, I mean, you'll see pretty much at once how there's resonance between what we've been saying. So I come to this panel not as a political analyst or government specialist, but as a writer and someone who's always stood against racism and racial typologies and gender discrimination. My expertise is in the realm of story and storytelling and in understanding the importance of story to how we understand ourselves, our identities, and how we mount our identities in relation to each other in society. Any projection of identity, as in identity politics, involves projecting a plausible and persuasive story. Since around 2008 or so, and this is my worry as a critical practitioner in story, in the realm of story, that since around 2008 or so, the so-called alt-right, the hard right, is not only in the ascendant, but in the narrative ascendant. They are politically on top right now, at this point in time, 2017, because they have found highly effective ways of not only telling the best stories, but also projecting and broadcasting them. And they also, and this is where I would completely agree with you, all very simple stories, very sort of straightforward stories, easy to grasp, told as memes. When I say stories, I don't only mean post-truth and post-fact assertions, such as we might associate with the new US presidency, though these are important and concerning. These aren't strictly speaking fictions, yet nor are they the truth. Rather, I mean the paradox of what J.M. Coetzee calls the good story, where fictions are used as ways of telling human truths. Any one of the stories that you may have read as a child or that you may still tell to yourself, the Cinderella story tells an important story known to us all of rags to riches, but also of receiving one's just desserts. Indicatively, though the Trump presidency ceaselessly weaves a fabric of false claims and unfounded charges against its enemies, it always asserts that such claims and such charges are the truth. But the human fact through fiction pathway or paradox is that much more sophisticated to conceptualize. What are these convincing stories that the ascendant right is telling itself, telling all of us, trying to persuade us of? And, importantly, what might be the stories that we might levy against them? So first, the first question. The alt-right, just to use that sort of shorthand, the alt-right stories, none of them very palatable, yet all currently persuasive, include, and we've already heard from the other two speakers, stories of the fearsome stranger, stories of the threat from across the border, of the importance of us against them, of white as right. The story of, if you are not with us, you are against us. The story, and this is a Trump favorite, of the zero sum. Your loss is my gain. My gain has to be your loss. Stories also of the natural inequality of human beings, so of natural hierarchy and of the social order needing to mimic the natural order. What are the alternative stories that currently have less traction, that are being told in small echo chambers and the glass bubbles of social media? The stories possibly of identity politics, the stories of the liberal left. That diversity produces stronger communities and thriving economies, as well as interesting cultural mixes. That welcoming the stranger increases productivity. That speaking several languages, both actually and metaphorically, produces better understanding. That liberties need to be qualified with equality. These are much harder stories. They're conceptually difficult. They're harder to tell, and they're harder to sell. Yet the history of British immigration in the late 19th century, of Dutch immigration across the 19th into the 20th centuries, of US immigration and of Canada today, immigration into Canada today, all demonstrate that when cultures tell themselves these stories, the second tranche of stories, and when these stories are supported by stable social structures, they have a way of becoming peacefully embedded, of being realized. Yet in our current state of things today, these other stories seem to have less traction. And against them are deployed these powerful stories that have deep and dangerous roots, as every authoritarian state in the 20th century knew. Stories of scapegoating and scaremongering, of fear and paranoia. How is it that these stories are currently thriving? Is it because we're being overrun by immigrants? Is it because they're taking all our jobs? Is it because black and ethnic minorities will soon be running this country? No, again, as authoritarian leaders in the past were well aware, they're thriving because of general ignorance, because of political illiteracy and cultural monolingualism, which is institutionally fostered and supported, including by the traditional media, as in the right-wing press, and by, as I already mentioned, the glass bubbles of social media. We keep telling ourselves the same stories in our little bubbles of identity politics. Secondly, they are thriving because of the ill-formed fetishization of the will of the people. This is where I think I also coincide with what Tariq Ramadan was saying, where the people is assumed to be a homogeneous group, honest, forthright, and always in the right. The will of the people, by the way, is a potent story, and one that the right currently has captured fully and entirely. Yet this story of the will of the people is making a mockery of traditional democratic institutions. Let us never forget that had the British government always backed the will of the people, the legalization of homosexuality and the outlawing of racial discrimination in 1965 would never have taken place. And finally, these other stories are thriving because the left has failed to concede the level of its current defeat. The extent to which it has lost control of the discourse, the extent to which it is marginalized and shut out of the institutional structures that support the persuasive stories, the extent to which the dialogue about power, representation, and inequality has been shut down or is simply being ignored. So what's the way forward? And I just want to sort of give a few thoughts. These are by no means conclusive and by no means, they're somewhat scattershot. The way for other identities to be countered is not merely to find better ways of telling the stories of these identities or to construct higher and more authoritative platforms where they might be broadcast. The way forward is to engage in dialectical debate and exercise critical solidarity, that is, to balance criticism with solidarity, to give our allies hard advice, yet to stay connected. The way forward is to admit that the situation is dark and that we are weak and our weapons are ineffective, as did M.K. Gandhi, for example. The way forward is to think about how powerful the right's stories are, yet not to be distracted by them, and to remain constantly aware of the policies that they may be mobilizing using their stories of us and them and of zero sum as a smokescreen. The way forward, as Bernice King, the daughter of Martin Luther King, wrote, is to resist by keeping positive, by keep telling the positive stories. Don't give up, even though they may not be listened to. Keep telling them. Keep your message positive. Those who oppose peace and justice want us to be angry and fearful because this is the story from which the darkest policies will grow. The way forward is also to support the humanities, as it's in this fertile ground that other good stories can grow, and that the outstanding stories of sharing and overcoming have formed in the past. The way forward is to check all our stories against fact. Try to obtain at least 2 sources, at least 2 witnesses for any story, to continue to speak truth to power in spite of weakness. The way forward is to remember that the way forward finally is to remain watchful and careful about how the rights stories are being normalized, how terrifyingly high the new bar of the dangerous story and the story of the fearsome stranger is being set. It's never been so high. So let us stand together. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So, poet, narratives are powerful indeed. We're about to open the floor. We'll have roving mics around, but I want to go back to Professor Woods really quickly. So, whose responsibility, and this is for everyone, but we'll start with you again, so just really in 2 to 3 minutes, whose responsibility do you think it is to shift this mindset?
I think it's everybody's. I think there's 4 things that you've got to do to move to a different politics. And the first is mutual respect. And that I mean deeply. And here, you know, I think if we sit in Oxford and we talk about the general ignorance of the people and their political illiteracy, not only are we not respecting people, but we're not understanding that their experience is as valid as ours of life. As a middle-class white woman, I have an incredibly positive view of the police. They are absolutely always incredibly helpful, kind, courteous to me. They help me when I'm lost in London. They offer me umbrellas when I'm standing in Oxford. Marvelous. Do I think that that's the experience that everybody in Britain has of the police? Absolutely not for 1 second. I can point to somebody that looks a bit different to me and tell you that their experience of the police is one of fear, of one of harassment, of one of... And guess what? We're talking about the same institution in the same country. We have different life experiences. And I think it's very important to start by recognizing that we're not talking about those ignorant, illiterate people out there. We're talking about people like us whose identities have been switched on in a different way, in a different context. So 3 concrete policies for thinking about how we deal with that. The first is a very obvious economic one. We talk about economic growth growing the size of the cake, as if automatically everybody gets a larger slice of the cake, when actually we know that's not true. The whole point of economic growth growing the size of the cake is that there's more cake to compensate the losers. There's no country or no place in history where economic growth has benefited everybody equally at the same time. And yet the policies, the economic policies of most of our countries over the last 3 decades have gradually reduced the extent to which we compensate the losers. And that's why people say globalization is great for you, the elite. You get talented workers from abroad, you make profits which you can shift abroad and not pay any tax on. You can fly footloose around the world, exploiting cheaper and cheaper workers wherever you find them, unconstrained by government policy. So globalization is very good for some. So when you say it's increasing Britain's GDP, just tell me more about what share of that I'm going to get, those people will say. So the first is actually thinking hard about how we're compensating the losers from the growth that we're enjoying, because that problem's going to get higher and higher, because it's the 1% of the 1% who have the fastest growing wealth. So inequality is a problem for everybody. That's why Swiss bankers are talking about universal basic income. It's why Bill Gates is talking about taxing robots, because they recognize that we're now on a trajectory that's not sustainable. So number one is taxing. Number two is really thinking about community. It's thinking about the track that we're on, whether it's here or in France or in the United States, where housing and education is more and more segregated. In other words, we're designing a context in which people are going to be more and more fearful of one another, and where we're using government authority in ways that have no legitimacy. So if we take the Edelman barometer of trust in government, guess what? The good news is the elite all trust each other more than ever before, and the bad news is that the general population no longer trusts the elite. So what does that mean for government? It means people don't trust government. So when governments say, we are going to impose 1,000 refugees on this city, people feel that control has been wrested of them. It makes them worry for their culture. It makes them worry for their social and their economic position. But what's really curious is if you went to that community, school by school and church by church, and said, would you take a family of refugees? Would you look after people who are really in need? That same community would probably say yes. And they would feel that they were in control of the process. And they would feel that this was something that they were in charge of. And I think that we've not paid enough attention to how our policies and the way we adopt policies affect a sense of community. And the third is communication. And here I very much agree with what Elika was saying, that the old ways of communication are dead. If you look at, again, Edelman stats, 69% of people trust leaks more than they trust official statements. And think about what counts as a leak, fake news, whatever, right? We see the same statistics. 3/4 of people trust social media, and they don't trust institutions. They don't trust established media. So think about the media that President Trump's election campaign used. The only established media used was the New York Post. Everything else, from Breitbart through, was a brand new media vehicle. So we've got to get smart to that and start thinking about how other movements in our societies use all of those different channels of communication and accept the fact that the elite, who are no longer trusted and whose means of communication is no longer trusted, cannot simply proclaim that we're legitimate, that we're doing things that are in your benefit, that all is going to wash out just fine, because we've no longer got the position to do that. So those are my three things to do.
Okay. Really quickly, Professor Ramadan, or?
No, that's fine with me.
It's fine? Should I just open? Yeah. Yeah? Okay. All right. So, who's going first? Hands high up. Look. All right, I'm going to start with Sam, all the way at the back, and then we'll go to Jelko over here, Ida, and then Pakra.
You know them all.
I know. It's it's family.
Naming them.
Naming them, yes. Yes. We'll take a first set of questions. Yeah.
Right. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your talk. Responding to something that you said, Elika, but a question for all of you. I think it's interesting to call this a post-truth era. I would maybe prefer to call it a lie era, since that's what's going on. I mean, I think you mentioned 2 sources. You know, the New York Times has frequently had up to 17 sources for some of its stories that people still don't believe. On the flip side, Trump can tweet about how Obama is tapping his phones, and even though that's proved to be definitively untrue, it's estimated that about 40% of Americans will still believe that. So, Nairi, you also talked about communication and how we communicate. What can we do to combat that, the sort of ethos of the lie era? What solutions maybe do we have there?
Okay, thank you. Jelko?
Thank you. So I would like to probe a little bit the framework of this conversation, especially with the pillar notion of identity. So usually in this conversation, I go back to Hannah Arendt, who made a difference between prejudice and judgment. And when she wrote about prejudice in politics, especially referring to authoritarian regimes, she was making a difference between these two, because prejudice is mostly in the domain of society. People pick up ready-made truths. They don't interrogate them, but they somehow carry in their mind. And judgment is more in the domain of public policy, and Professor Woods mentioned what is the role of governments in shaping this environment. But it seems to me what's missing in this conversation is the notion of prejudice, because here we are not talking about us versus them and in terms of identities. Who defines them and what is the content of them is basically a prejudice. It's not identity. To give you a personal example that is applicable to Muslims and indigenous communities everywhere in the world, people don't have a problem with my identity of being Roma. They have a problem with their own perception or interpretation what my identity is about. So ultimately, we should talk, in my view, about the role of prejudice in politics, not our role of identity in politics. Identities per se might be problematized, but what we are actually facing is how politics replaces judgment.
Thanks for problematizing our topic. No, good question. Aida.
Hello, Aida, Blavatsky School of Government. I enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much for it. I just wanted to reflect on one thing I realized, and it's kind of, I see a common trait in the Ottoman Empire and how it fell, and how the Balkans dissoluted, how Yugoslavia dissoluted, and now the same with Europe. You have an economic crisis, and people stop playing with identities, and it's very hard to go back to the trait. Even when Yugoslavia was about to fall, they had some economic solutions, but it was hard to go back and kind of prevent the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the bloody way it went through. And now I see again in Europe the same trait. You have economic crisis, you have high inequality, and it's not the EU actually who created that inequality. So when people perceive the inequality and how the government failed them, they start blaming the EU, thinking their government, if they go out, and that happened with Britain. And it wasn't the EU which failed them, it was the government. Right. But we cannot, it's hard to go back now and to suppress this xenophobia and everything. So what to do, how to reform the EU and to prevent the same trait that I am afraid I see coming.
So what can the institution in the EU do to combat that? Yes.
Hi, my name is Prakhar. Thank you for your talk. My question is specifically to Professor Ramadan. So you talked about, so I'll start with an assumption that democracy is the most favored form of governance. If that is so, politicians rely on the support of the people. Would you agree that they will have to appeal to a certain kind of identity in order to come to power? Now, that identity could be anything: economic, religious, linguistic, regional. And would you also agree that democracy is inherently exclusionary in nature, which means that even when people are coming to power, only certain people are represented selectively. Further, when results are delivered, they are delivered selectively. So there will be protectionist policies that will not allow immigration, for instance, to exist throughout the world. There will be trade barriers on certain goods, for example. And to what extent do you think are those issues that can be resolved in order to comply with broader ideas that you talked about in terms of emotional complexity, nuances, non-domination, and reconnecting ethics and values in this process of governance? Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll start with you, Professor Ramadan, and then Elike, you can choose a question, and then Professor Woods. Okay, great.
Yeah. I'm not sure I have an answer about what we can do when it comes to this hypertrophy of the means that we have when it comes to communication. It's very difficult. It's really very difficult because we have to avoid patronizing and looking down, people when it comes to their opinion. But the problem is that what we are dealing with, and some research in the United States about the impact of the social media, for example, in the way you are looking at the world, it's huge. It's huge. A sense of, we are not responsible, there are powers over there, so anonymous, dealing with our destiny and dealing with us, and not feeling that we are involved as citizens in the whole thing. I think that's important, but we have to face this with lucidity and with this awareness. When you look at $15 million put by Trump in his campaign to Cambridge Analytica to help him to target 200,000 single individual and to tailor the email by the name, knowing the data that you are using and how you are dealing, that's making us, it's dangerous. So we are in a way monitored to the way we are dealing when, and at the end, they know how to talk to us. So communication is very powerful. How are you going to communicate? And this is why I think that what you said, it's very important. My main problem is not the far-right parties coming, it's the narrative that they are it's everywhere, even in traditional parties. So on some points, by the way, I don't see the difference between what we call, social democrats or in the way they deal with this identity politics. And it comes to your second question, I agree, you can come to this discussion by saying, at the end of the day, it's not identity, it's prejudices, of course. But all the discussion about who is talking about identity and how and from where, it's all based on this. It's all about perceptions. So you can call it as you want, but at the end, the questions that the people are facing day in, day out, myself, as a European, coming to a media, a mainstream media, and saying, people are saying, oh, what you are saying is very controversial. I was expecting something about violence. It was, you are saying that Islam is a Western religion. What is controversial in this? Millions of citizens are already Europeans and Americans. So it is a Western religion. But the problem is the identity politics is putting Islam outside the West. It should be against the West, or at least outside. This otherness that we are. So you can talk about prejudices and making it something which is a construction. Yes, it's true, but it is. But identity politics is about constructing a perception of the other. So you can use the term, but at the end, I would say that in the terms of, for example, this is why I liked what Amin Maalouf was doing and Amartya Sen when they were talking about, and they were coming to this from another route, in fact, and I would agree on this. About what you are saying, yes, of course. All what I'm saying is all these phenomena that we are witnessing today are putting in danger our democracies. That's my main point. The point is not to be against democracy. The point is when you have so powerful means to deal with your perception, to deal with your fear, and to deal with you not trusting the political discourse to the point that you are following your emotions or your fear or the security policy. This is where our democracies are in danger. Add to this the media and the way they are covering the whole thing, because in fact, emotional politics is making money. It makes money. It's part of the whole system, and this is why I would go for something which is a bit, I agree with what you were saying about institution, about police, for example, but I wouldn't stop there. I am not going to ask myself, okay, they are nice with me, with you, not always with me, but, and they are not so. It's a system. You need to understand the institution. So this is why we have to listen to voices saying, no, police is an institution that is used by power, and we need to understand the relationship that this power has and the way it is dealing with people. It's not about me as an individual, it's a system. And to get a sense of how do we complexify this and come to study and to promote something which is an understanding of the way it works, it's important. So all the voices are important in this. So I'm not saying that they have no right to have rules and protection. And even to speak about a nation, I don't have a problem with speaking about my nation, depending how do you deal with your nation in the sense of belonging. If it's an exclusive and rejecting process, I would say no, that's the end of what I thought was positive.
Sorry, my question was that democracy inherently rests on the idea of identity politics. Without identity politics, democracy may not exist. And therefore, to ask people to engage on that given that democracy is the most favored way of governance, you can never remove identity politics from governance itself.
Right.
I guess I would answer that slightly differently, and say that for democracy to work, for any collective human endeavor to work, you need trust. And the more trust you have, the more social trust you have, the better a community works. The more trust you have in a democracy, the better the democracy works. In a small town where everybody's known each other for hundreds of years, people have a reasonable chance of adjudicating who they can trust. They might be prejudiced. They might say, oh, you know, his father was a crook, so I won't trust him. But there will be it will be easier to make judgments about trust. Not because you will trust everybody that you've known for 100 years, but you'll know who to trust and who not to trust. So the problem with believing in an infinitely open community and saying any community can and should be able to absorb an infinite number of strangers to it is that it's very difficult to instantly build trust to all of those strangers. And I think we actually have to recognize that. And we have to recognize that for communities to work, you need active ways to help those people build enough trust to work collectively towards something. You know, lots of you have done game theory. You know what happens. When there's no trust, you get to defect effect. You always get into the worst possible outcome. So that modicum of trust is necessary. So in that sense, democracy is by necessity, to some degree, exclusionary. And of course, the argument I just made could be made to justify some very exclusive policies. And that's obviously not what I'm trying to do with my argument.
What are you doing exactly?
No, so I'm saying that going back to the arguments I was making before is that when you have a diverse community, you need to exercise all of your policies and community to build trust. You need places where people come together. You need schools where people come together. You need community centers where people come together. The people in that community need to find ways to trust. If you bring a community and you segregate it and you create ghettos, then you will create fear and you will not have a community that can work together. The only other thing I wanted to pick up was I think the comment made about the tools of social media, Cambridge Analytica, whatever. I think Cambridge Analytica have vastly overclaimed their role and success, and that a lot of what they've done is not new. I mean, advertising companies have been very quick to use big data, which is why when you go online, you instantly get advertisements for something approximating your favorite food or the favorite thing that you look for on Google that perhaps you can't afford to buy. And there it pops up every 5 minutes in front of you. That part is widely used and people don't seem to object to. What's changed is using that information deliberately to destroy trust and deliberately to weaponize people's fear of others in their community. And I think that does bring something that's very, very dangerous to each of our societies because they so rely on trust. And what psychologists tell us about fear, and why I use the word weaponizing fear, is because fear is a very sticky emotion. It has physiological effects. It stops people sleeping. It causes them to make different kinds of judgments. Humans have very little capacity to remember the sources of information, but when they're afraid, when it's fear, they have even less capacity to remember the source. So to Sam's point, there's no point saying, but there are 17 other sources that show that this is wrong, because actually, if you've provoked fear in somebody, they're not going to be attentive to the source anymore at all. So I think we do have to recognize why the provocation of fear has a particular danger of its own and think about how we respond to that.
Great. I want to take the last set of questions, and then, Elike, I would like to begin, once we take the last set of questions, Professor Elike, sorry, to actually also respond to Sam's question. So, last set of questions, and let me start with Richa, and the man in the blue shirt, Rob, woman in the blue shirt over there, and we'll have you as the last question. If we have time, you at the back over there, we'll get back to you. Is that cool? Sorry, I'm like you, the ones I don't know. So we'll start with Richa. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is really insightful. I think based on the previous conversation, I just wanted to talk about how we sometimes infantilize or trivialize the idea of democracy. And democracy isn't just voting, and that's why we're tempted to have referendums about complex issues. It is sort of, democracy is a much deeper thing than just voting. Professor Sen was in Oxford a few weeks ago, and he talked about one important apparatus of democracy, and that is sort of education and increasing awareness about critical issues. Another is institutions, some of which can be counter-majoritarian. So courts are one very important institution of liberal democracies, as are also other accountability mechanisms, and those are under threat as well. Those are being undermined as well by majoritarian forces, and I would love to hear the panel's views about how we can deepen the understanding of democracy and the institutions that we need to strengthen it.
So, Risha, this is for the whole panel. Okay, I'll probably just direct it to someone. I'll remember that so we can get all our speakers to go. May I please just remind all of us to have it short, sharp, and sweet? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Vasilios. I'm a DPhil in law.
A little louder.
Yeah, sorry. Is that better?
Better.
Okay, my name is Vasilios. I'm a DPhil in law, and I had a question for whoever wants to answer, really. It's really interesting, but for the moment, we've mainly focused on identity politics as being us versus the other, the mean foreigner, the mean Muslim, the mean black, the mean whatever, right? Which is awfully and has bad consequences, I agree. But isn't also identity politics a way for us as a community to be different from the majority? Meaning that us DPhil in law want X thing or Y thing, the LGBT community wants some things. And that's also identity politics. And just to go to the question that was asked by the gentleman before, this creates groups, and with the data we have on these groups, we can now promise things to these groups. If today you'd have an election in Oxford, and you know that Greek DPhils, me, want free coffee, you'll win the Greek DPhil vote, right? If you know in France that LGBT community, wants the gay marriage, you'll promise them that, and you'll have their vote, probably. Know that these two policies are good, in my opinion, especially the free coffee. Now, what happens now is that we've created many communities, many identities, different ones, and we have some bad things happening from that, right? So my question, I guess, is how do you stop the parties from doing that, and not only the governments? And secondly, since policies, and I'm doing policies, DPhil, right, are always either too late or too early, what other ways than the three or four policy solutions that Professor Woods gave could we have in that matter? Now, I don't know if my question makes sense, but thank you.
Okay, thank you. Rob? Rob over here.
Rob from Australia. In what ways has your approach as academia been part of the problem to date? And what would be the most radical innovation you could envisage within academia to prepare students better, to contribute better to addressing these issues?
Super good question. Can I ask the panelists to actually use that question as they wrap up? Yeah?
The first bit was, the second bit was what's the innovation? And the first bit was...
In what ways has academia been part of the problem today?
Right.
Okay, thank you. Muglu?
Hello, panelists. My name is Miriam. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I will try to keep my questions short and sweet. So it seems to me that a lack of access to education, or either that or a failure on part of higher educational institutions, seems to be, a massive problem. And I'm surprised that education hasn't come up in this conversation. So I was just wondering how education plays into the narrative of identity politics, and if you could elaborate on that.
All right, our last question.
Sorry, it might be a bit longer than you like, but apologies. Thank you for your contributions.
Short and sweet.
Yes, I'll try. I worked for Oxford City Council towards the end of my career, and I was given some diversity training. And they quoted some work by Henri Tagel in the 60s and 70s. He knew about identities because he was a Polish Jew who had to hide his identity because he got stuck in France in the Second World War. At any rate, he became a social experimental psychologist. And he found that when you had groups of children, you separated them into two groups, there was a natural tendency to support your own group and to oppose the other group. And the question, if that's true, it's a natural tendency, do we actually not need to educate everybody to counteract this potential tendency?
Okay, thank you. So, will you start? Choose a question and answer.
So I'll pick up on the question about Roma identity and that question, and kind of a nuance that's been trailing through a number of the questions. There's masses of research to show that if you put people in proximate situations, people from different cultures, races, backgrounds, identities together, trust builds and prejudice is broken down. So the problem with the classroom situation, that experiment of separating the two groups, which I've seen happen actually, is that yes, you're separating them so they're not talking to each other, and polarization happens. So to counteract polarization, this is difficult. All of these policies, these approaches are difficult and require time. But to combat polarization, I think we all need to foster different ways of crossing paths, of coming together, of forging proximity. And then the other thing to say, and I said it in the sort of the second half of my remarks, so just to reiterate, yes, education is important. When I talked about political illiteracy, I was talking about the need to educate ourselves politically, to educate ourselves in the benefits of democracy, for example, to educate ourselves in the precepts of other religions, to be aware of not only our history, but the histories of Europe, the histories of global history also. All of this requires time investment. It requires work. The gathering of knowledge, the knowledge of the other, requires an inordinate amount of time, which is why I feel quite pessimistic in saying everything that I've said and in making my recommendations earlier, because there is no quick fix. Trust takes ages to build, 100 years to use the timeline that Nari Woods was referring to in her example. So proximity, yes. Work, doing a lot of research on both ourselves and the so-called other, very, very important. And then as to the question of how has the Academy been part of the problem and what might be its radical innovation, how the Academy has been part of the problem is, I think, I may be shot down for this, is in not speaking enough in not turning outwards to the wider public, in building walls rather than in opening doors. And what might be the radical innovation, I have to think about that for a moment.
Thank you. Ramadan?
Yes, so there were some questions about the first one. I think that what you said about democracy, I really think that that's very important. That the way we have to deal with democracy is not only as a structure, it's even not only institutions, is to talk about what is needed, what are the conditions and the prerequisites. And very often we are not talking about this. And by not talking about this, we are in danger because other means that are very powerful when it comes to, I still think I'm still very scared of what we have on internet and the way, even with the facts and figures, of course, what Cambridge Analytica was doing was done and it's done, but still the power that they put in Brexit, it's very, so I think that this is where we need to ask ourselves without dismissing and lacking respect towards our fellow citizens is at one point what are the prerequisites, and there is no democracy without education. And education means also this understanding of our role and our responsibility. It's exactly the opposite of nurturing a victim mentality. It's the opposite of this, which I think it's missing now. And I would say that what you are saying, it's an important thing. The other thing which is the question of communication and coming together. I think that in what you are saying about identity and in which way it could be also positive, because they want some rights and they consider themselves, because this is the reality, as minority within a society. I would say that the problem that we have in this, how can we go from a closed identity, a negative identity, it's not to reduce our struggle to our identity, but to some principles that we are sharing. So I would say that what we have in our society, and that's the problem that we have with racism, with gender equality, is very often we take it as our struggle versus the majority. And I would say that if we come to some principles and we have a transversal and crossing the board alliance of people speaking and trying to say, you know what, the black problem is not the problem of the black people. The gender is not the problem of women. It's us coming together. When I think that this is very important is when you change the potential way of dealing with your identity or LGBT or whatever to something which is broader than this, let us talk about principles and shared principles within the society. And I think that this is missing now. I really think it's missing with all the, we have multiple ways of dealing with racism and xenophobia, and it's completely fragmented. It's completely fragmented. And this comes to the other question that you asked within academia. One of the main problems that I see within academia is this fragmented knowledge that we have. Is we become specialized in a field and we are not able to connect. And I think that the answer to the global problems that we have is connecting transdisciplinary approach. Transdisciplinary approach, connecting also university with cities, university with the world. And I think that if we are not doing this, we keep on, in fact, I would say today, when it comes to knowledge, it's part of the problem, fragmentation of knowledge. And not questioning the goals of the knowledge. Why are you getting the knowledge that you are getting? What are you trying to do with this? So nurturing knowledge for the sake of knowledge is having these ivory towers and not coming to the world and not being able to have an impact and to share. In fact, to understand the real meaning of being a teacher is to be at the service of the people. A university is at the service of the society, not the other way around. It's not for us to think that we think far from the people. So, and then I would say that this is where I would look to, and propose in our way of teaching this transdisciplinary approach and to be much more open to other things and to connect things much more, a sense of complexity in the way we teach. And this is why, for example, for me today, when I look at the schools that we have, I would like our kids to have, and to reconcile with disciplines that are lost today. History, it's important. Philosophy, it's important. History and even religions, it's very important. You want a pluralistic society, you want to deal, and how are you going to deal with your fear if you are told that your ignorance is your freedom? So ignorance is not your freedom. Ignorance is the starting point for you to react in an emotional way, to be scared of who you are not. So, and then there is something which I would like us to get, because this is also the answer to the world culture that we have today, is to reconcile ourselves with teaching, imagination, and arts. Not as secondary things, but as essential to the way you look at the world, because these, imagination and arts and culture are so important in the way you are. So I would say that this is what I see missing in our universities and in our schools altogether.
Thank you. Professor Woods. I love the question about where is identity a good thing, as it were? Where is an exclusive identity a good thing? And the obvious answer to me is look at sports teams. And, humans like to compete. I think competition is a fabulous thing. Let's not pretend that life is all, sort of squidgy getting on. Competition is something that drives human beings to even better cooperation with each other and to even better performance. So you can put people that might be from divided communities in the same soccer team in one uniform and put them against people who might not like each other in the other team. And it's amazing how quickly they'll cooperate to win. So, you know, I think identity, exclusive identity, does have a powerful role to play. And that we shouldn't be afraid of. Human beings need a sense of belonging. And a sense of belonging sometimes is exclusive. And we have to play with that and think about that in society. And then, how should academia change? So, my first thought, Rob, I had two thoughts when you asked your question. My first was a taxi driver who said to me, with the great wisdom of a London taxi driver, he asked me what I did, and I said I was an academic, and he looked very, very, very suspicious of this, and said the thing about academics is that the more you learn, the less you know. And I sort of looked at him and said, you know, tell me more, you know. And he said, the thing is, with all that learning, you go into a situation, you think you know exactly what's going on. And you don't look, you don't observe, you don't learn from it. And I think there's great truth in that we can have magnificent theories and data sets, and we can completely miss what's going on because our learning actually blinds us to observe what's going on. I think that's one part of it. My other thought was to remember a film that probably no one in the room has seen, but just after Michael Portillo lost his seat as a Conservative Member of Parliament, and he'd been part of Mrs. Thatcher's cabinet. So he was quite a free market, tough Conservative. And he agreed, bless him, to do this fly-on-the-wall documentary where he would take the place of a single mother on a council estate. So before he goes off to do it, he says, oh, well, you know, some of my education and judgment, you know, I'll be able to feed the children the right sort of food, make sure they do their homework, get them to school, you know, we can turn this around in a few days. Okay, so then they film him and he arrives on the council estate. And of course, he quickly finds he can't do anything. And at the end of the first day, he's just sitting there going, I don't know how she does it. I don't know how she even survives, this single mother. And so I think, so part of me there's also that silly Hollywood movie, Changing Places, where the rich banker takes the place of the homeless black man and vice versa, right? And they quickly learn what it's like to live in each other's shoes. So in my head was actually, in a world where some would argue it's getting more and more difficult because society's more separate, for people to have empathy, then maybe you need some field work or some changing places, or some learning to observe instead of learning to project your own academic learning.
Thank you so much. Before we go for the drinks reception, Ida is going to just wrap up our takeaway points and, of course, thank those who've supported us to put this event on. So, Ida.
Yeah, great. So I'll just quickly go through the thank you. So on behalf of OxWIP, I would like to thank Professor Woods, Professor Bohemer, and Professor Ramadan for really taking the time to respond to our call. I think it speaks volume in the type of culture that is being fostered at Oxford when leading figures in their field respond to the call of a student society. I would like also to thank Professor Kate O'Brien for being an amazing mentor to our society, as well as Vicky and all the Torch and BSG team. As an immigrant in this country, I think like many of you in the audience, I felt that identity politics have structured in many ways my life, from the mundanes of who are my friend, what I eat, to what I feel about the British police. But I think I'm hopeful today that the nuances in our conversation really show that maybe if we push our government and our institutions to foster more critical stories, more honest stories, we can develop a different type of identity, an identity that is about justice, about learning about each other, about accepting differences, and maybe about telling the hard truths when they need to be told. And at OxWIP, we're very much committed to furthering that type of discourse. So we invite you all to grab a copy of our term card for our events that are coming up. And I also would like just to take the time to say that we have a drinks reception coming up. So if you would like to further the conversation, please, we invite you to proceed to the forum. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.